The new patch in TFT has completely flipped everything on its head. Every lobby doesn't have those 6 Vexotech players trying to fight for the same units every single game. Instead, we have a bunch of new compositions and we have some new kings on top. I spent the entire weekend watching tournaments, talking to the world champ, and climbing the patch to challenger myself. Let's go ahead and dive into the TFT Academy tier list and find out what exactly is the best and how do we play them. This patch is an AP based meta. Almost half the lobby every single game will have at least 2 Street Demon players and probably 2 Vex players, and that just means that tier is going to be a premium component. Spear of Shojin is the most versatile mana item because you can go into pretty much anything, and you can even still go Shojin onto Vex. But there's still a lot of blue buff holders because Annie is a lot better, and you can also still play some reroll with it. Vex also has a ton of different variations that we'll talk about in a little bit. So blue buff is a primary slam as well in this current meta. AD is not bad. It's mainly driven through Marksmen Vanguard, and you can still slam Rageblade, but right now Zeri is really weak, and the alternative rerolls like Vayne are a lot weaker as well. Infinity Edge is also still very versatile, but Infinity Edge tends to be on the secondary carry of a lot of compositions. So if you're playing a Urgot or a Samira in a lot of these comps, for example, you can use an Infinity Edge, but you're not trying to go out of your way to slam it. As a result, things like Dragon's Claw is going to be a lot better as well to fight against all these AP. Just look at it, 3 AP comps in the S tier and a couple of them doing well in the A tier. But I would also say that B tier right now is actually kind of close to A tier. It's just that it's much more conditional. And when you have so many different conditional comps that can do well, surely you can play something. Even things like Anima Squad and Zeri will have their moments, which we'll talk about in a little bit during this video. There are also a lot of new comps in meta, like the new variation of Zeri, the Urgot comp, Naafiri Reroll, a bunch of 1-cost reroll, and even the Long Crocodile, aka the 6 Rapid Fire Renekton, which we'll cover in a little bit. All right, let's go ahead and find out what are the best comps currently in the metagame and how to play them. The most popular and strongest comp this patch currently is 7 Street Demon. It basically has no weaknesses. It's strong early, mid, and late. It has really high cap. It can win a lot of boards. And there's a lot of good augments, both economic item and combat augments. It's also surprisingly really item flexible because you put a bunch of AP items on Brand. If you get even more AP, you put it on Ziggs as a duo carry. And then all your AD sword items go onto Samira. The reason why it's really strong is because 7 Street Demon went from 15% and 1580 in AP to 17. And while that seems like a really small buff, the reality is Street Demons get all those bonuses doubled, and then they also buff things like Zyra and Dr. Mundo. So it kind of just padded a bunch of his weaknesses and then made its top end even better because Samira got buffed. So the optimal way to play Street Demon is now just to pretty much play 7 Street Demon no matter what. And even if you hit some of the really powerful other units like Viego, for example, or Zac, you don't really take out 7 Street Demon for it. I've seen a lot of people try things like, oh, I'll take out Zyra and I'll play Viego because that's a techie and I'm playing a 5-cost. Or I'll, replace Dr. Mundo because I don't have Kabuko and then I'll play Zac instead. And it's just weaker than 7 Street Demon. So it does actually make it a quite simple comp to play and easy to execute. I do think that late game variations at level 10, you probably can play some other 5 costs, but yeah, keep it pretty simple. Jinx ends up being the item holder for Samira, so a lot of times there's a debate between whether or not you put items on Jinx 2 versus Samira 1. I personally would keep it on Jinx 2 because I think she's quite good, but Samira sometimes does more damage as well, so your mileage may vary. And if you don't have Jinx, you can play Rengar, and it's the same thing too. If you don't have Samira, you can play Rengar. Don't go too crazy over Street Demon emblem. I don't think this emblem is that impactful. You can put it on a Ziggs, which is nice. You can put it on a Kabuko, which is nice, but it's not that important in my opinion. Also, if you do play Ziggs as your duo carry, playing Ziggs without Cyber Boss is pretty weak. So I would just not even prioritize Ziggs if I don't have Kabuko or Cyber Boss. You can play 7 Street Demon plus something else like another frontline unit, or maybe that's how you fit in some of those 5 costs you hit. I personally think that 7 Street Demon is a little too strong. I hope they nerf it. I liked it when 5 was more optimal because then you could play 5 Street Demon plus Cyber Boss, 5 Street Demon plus more techies, 5 Street Demon plus Strategist, and it felt like you actually had variety. Right now, it's just pretty much this comp almost every single time. Vex actually is in a really interesting spot. The composition has evolved more because they buffed some of her duo carries and they nerfed a little bit of her Vexotech variation. So now you have to be thinking about more on your roll down than just the usual Vexotech core. So a lot of people know how to play this by now. You pretty much play 5 Vexotech with Vex. You play Varus as a duo carry. The best secondary item right now is Hyper Fangs. They nerfed Hollow Bow a lot, but you can also play Hollow Bow on Varus. And then you stack Mordekaiser and Sejuani as your tanks. You play Jax instead of Renekton, and then you play Jhin instead of Viego, and you just play like a pretty nice core. As noted here in stage 4, you end up playing 5 Vexotech in the mid game, and then you top in with 5 costs. It's one of the best compositions to play from Loose Streak or Cypher Cash Out, so this is definitely something to think about if you have Tier and Rod and you just don't have an opener. You can just Loose Streak and prioritize getting perfect Vex items and then play for the stage 4 spike. But what's more interesting about this patch, about Vex in my opinion, is that Vex actually has a couple of other variations that you can also roll down for. So don't feel like you have to roll down for Sejuani, you have to roll down for the Exotech core. You can instead play something like Vex Bruisers, which actually works really well because Cho'Gath is a lot better currently in the game. They finally got Cho'Gath to a spot where he's pretty solid, and specifically if you have good items for him, like a lot of pure tank items, you don't want to put like Sunfire Spark on him. Sunfire and Spark are more like offensive utility items for your front line. You want actually like pure tank items. Vex actually keeps that front line alive, and Cho'Gath, if he can cast 3 to 4 times, that is the win condition. The longer you can keep Cho'Gath casting it in the fight, the better he gets. They also buffed Urgot a lot. Urgot is way better this patch, and he ties in really well with Cho'Gath, with Boombot, and Executioner. So you have some options here for Vex Bruiser, which is really nice. So don't skip the Cho'Gath on your roll down. And 4 Bruiser is pretty solid with the Cho'Gath setup. Before Kabuko, just play any Bruiser. I mean, Alistar 2 probably can be pretty solid, or Mundo, and just flex around that. And then lastly, we have Divinicorp Vex, which is kind of similar to what we did with Divinicorp Z, which is just play the vertical Divinicorp and then put in a few units to make them better. So in this example, we have Cho'Gath and Urgot Vex, the same package, and then a bunch of Divinicorp units. Jarvan here is pretty optional. It's just nice to tie in the Vanguard and Slayer, but pretty flexible. You can just play a 5 cost here if it makes sense. Like, let's say you hit Zac, just go ahead and do that. You can also play Garen. Garen gives Divinicorp emblem, and you can have the Divinicorp mod go on Urgot or Cho'Gath. That also totally works. And so Vex has more options this patch, and that makes her more flexible. And even though she didn't get nerfed, it feels like she's slightly weaker because she has a couple of bad matchups. I don't think, for example, Vex is that great into Brand, because Brand can AoE and splash that Vex and take away a little bit of her true damage bonus. So matchup-wise, it's a little bit worse right now, but she has more options. So I think Vex is one of my favorite lines to play currently because, well, you can roll down for more different units besides the same 7 things. The last of the S tier comps that we have is Card Shark, aka Twisted Fate Reroll, and it's kind of interesting because they nerfed Twisted Fate's passive, and yet it feels like Twisted Fate got better because they increased his base damage off the AP scaling. And there's a bunch of words and numbers, but the takeaway is that Twisted Fate scales better with actual AP items instead of just attack speed. They made him less dependent on his attack speed, scaling his AP. In case you didn't know, he gains 1.5 ability power per each attack. That used to be 2. And so before, it felt like you had to go like double Rage Blade or, you know, Rage Blade Gunblade or like Shiv Gunblade, Rage Blade, like that kind of variation of attack speed. Now you can actually build AP items. I think Archangel Staff is the best according to the stats, but you can also build whatever makes sense. You can build Jewel Gauntlet. You see like Jewel Gauntlet and Guard Breaker. You see Death Cap. You can just kind of play actual flexibly with your items. And that's a really good thing because Twisted Fate doesn't necessarily need to do it just with his best in slot like before. The other thing about Twisted Fate is that they've innovated to now have 2 phases of the composition. The first is to stabilize on level 6. You know, you roll for Twisted Fate 2, get your Syndicate in, upgrade your front line, so on and so forth. But then you don't want to roll on 6 after that. Instead, you want to econ up and go to 7 because you want to roll for 3 costs. And while you do lose some odds on rolling for Twisted Fate on 6, you do ultimately care about your duo carry, and you care about the 5 Syndicate and getting Misfortune, because it's a really big deal to not only give the Kingpin hat to Twisted Fate, but also to Braum. And so that dynamic of rolling on 7 is really powerful. Roll on 7, get Braum 3 and Draven 3 as your duo carry, and you'd be surprised. I think Twisted Fate actually can cap much higher now. The joke was that Twisted Fate, you play from ahead, you get 4th. You play from behind, you get 4th. You don't do anything, and you somehow get like a 4th. It just felt like a composition that farmed 10 LP at a time. Now Twisted Fate can actually go way higher because Draven 3 is quite good. We've learned that through the Cypher Cash Out. So just play Draven as your duo, use Braum as your tank. Remember, you kind of want real tank items. We're kind of in a meta where the front line needs to hold. So make sure Braum actually has real tank items and just put utility on other units. And over time, you might even find yourself getting Draven 3, Braum 3 before Twisted of 8-3, but you're still stable. And then once you hit everything, you can go to 8 and play something like Gragas. Syndicate Emblem, for that reason, is very important. Sometimes Syndicate Emblem just allows you to hit 5 Syndicate without Misfortune, or just drop Shaco entirely and play a higher quality unit, maybe squeeze in that Bruiser, maybe get that 5 cost in. Fiddlesticks Reroll is also another comp that has gotten a lot better thanks to the Bruiser buffs. They buffed the early game with Alistar, Dr. Mundo, as we talked about. Cho'Gath is a lot better. And also Urgot, so they buffed around Fiddlesticks. And a lot of people really rate this really highly. I know that China, for example, thinks that Fiddlesticks is an S-tier comp. The only thing is that you can't really play Fiddlesticks easily unless you have the specific conditions, in my opinion. Things like a good artifact for him, like Blighting Jewel and Sniper's Focus. Even if you have a Bruiser emblem, you can play it. It's a little bit still sus in terms of its top end. So the top end of this composition is a lot better because you have Urgot that's buffed, and Cho'Gath, like we said, is really, really good if you get into 2-star. In fact, we've seen some people innovate a little bit by going to level 8 and rolling for Cho'Gath, and then you get access to things like Urgot and Kabuko odds, and then you deprioritize Fiddlesticks 3 because there's a big gap between Fiddlesticks 2 and Cho'Gath 1, and Fiddlesticks 2 and Cho'Gath 2. If you can get Cho'Gath 2, you're stable for way longer, surprisingly, because Cho'Gath will stall a lot for Fiddlesticks. And if Cho'Gath never dies, Fiddlesticks should theoretically have enough time with the double Archangels to just ramp a lot and get the kill anyways. And then over time, you will hit Fiddlesticks 3. It's really interesting. This set almost feels like you want to play one level ahead of reroll. Like, you know, usually roll on 7 for 3 cost, you roll on 6 for 2 cost. But because of how important some of these 4 and 5 costs are to unlocking the power of the composition, it feels like you want to over level. And because you have so much extra resources, like extra gold, sometimes you get random duplicators, things like that, you should be able to hit your 3 stars anyway, despite lower odds. So this is kind of the meta and the game shifting and adapting based on the set mechanics. So yeah, just make sure you get the Cho'Gath 2 online, and even if you have to go to 8 for that, I think that's totally fine. Cypher's actually weaker this patch. They nerfed its early game and buffed the late game scaling of it, so if you keep Cypher in longer, you get more rewards. But most people usually just play it for early mid-game to get resources, so it's effectively nerfed. That just makes it less consistent, and it's going to be harder to actually get it online. The good news is that Sejuani and all this Vexotech frontline is less contested because Zeri is so much weaker this patch. The bad news is that Draven is more contested, and he is often your primary reroll carry after you cash out. And so playing Cypher for a Cypher cash out and staying in a Cypher carry is less common, so you probably aren't going to be playing this very much. It's still good because it's Cypher, so if you do get a spot where you can play this composition and you cash out a really high reward, it's going to perform really well. You just have more resources than everybody. But the reality is a lot of people end up playing Cypher and then they pivot into something else. They play Cypher into Brand. They play Cypher into Vex. They play Cypher into Annie because these are high resource, high power, high ceiling compositions that just require the extra golden items. So proceed with caution. Cypher is pretty dicey, but it's still really good of a trait to play in general, and you can definitely cash it out. I would just be hesitant to play specifically this version, even though it's very powerful still. Most Infinity Edge and Rageblade openers, if you're playing a 4-cost level 8 line that you default to, is Aphelios Xayah Marksman. The most common frontline you play is Vanguard, but you can pretty much play anything. The whole point of this is just to get stuff in the way in front of Aphelios and Xayah and just let them kill a bunch of the enemies and let them ramp up. But don't feel like you have to play 4 Vanguard. I've seen people play Bastions or Bruisers or some kind of variation. And as long as you're able to, 1, try to activate Golden Knocks on Aphelios, that is important. And 2, just make sure that you have upgraded frontline. I think you're good to go. Anima Squad, for example, is not that powerful of a trait for Xayah. It just gives you 5 damage amp, which is 1/5 of a Giant Slayer. It's not that good. But it's nice for the resistances for Leona, and it's a nice early game. It just fits really easily with the composition, which is why it's a nice bonus. But let's say you hit Sejuani 2, Jax 2, and then you hit like Mordekaiser, Alistar. That's like totally fine to play with like Aphelios and play an Vexotech setup, and you get a frontline Vexotech item for free. You can just play that, and you just skip the Anima Squad entirely. That's totally fine. The composition is just very stable. The win rate isn't very high, but if you're uncontested, you hit quickly, you can get to level 9. And level 9 is pretty open-ended. You can play anything, really. The most common addition is Aurora with Jhin for Dynamo, and then you can like summon and extend your board. But level 9, surprisingly, is not that important for this composition. The most of the king making in this is whether or not you're able to win streak on stage 4 and be very, very powerful for it and punish a lot of low rollers. So in a sense, it's not really bad to just roll on 8 for the vast majority of the game and like never really push to 9. I mean, you do want to get to 9 eventually, but you can't really like overroll your gold on level 8 for this composition because it's kind of expensive. Xayah 2, Aphelios 2, Leon 2, and you want items on all of them. Don't obsess too much over best in slot either. You generally just want to give Xayah swords. You generally want to give bows to Aphelios and tank items to Leona. It's a very basic comp, fundamentals based. You know, a lot of people try to prioritize 3 items on Aphelios 1 when they have Xayah 2, put items on Xayah 2. If you have Jarvan 2 and Leona 1, put items on Jarvan 2, right? Just like play what is your strongest unit. Even if the items are suboptimal, use your item removers pretty aggressively to make sure you can preserve HP. It's just nice little front to back comp, pretty straightforward. Farm your thirds and your seconds with it and get your LP. The last of the A-tier compositions we have is Amp Naafiri, and it's predicated on the same concept that 5-amp is way too strong right now. They buffed it a lot, and now 5-amp is insane. If you can get to 5-amp with this composition, it's really, really good. But the thing that makes Naafiri really interesting is that there are so many item builds for her, and it all depends on what your primary item that you're building around is. So if you open up with Vexotech and Hyperfangs, Hyperfangs is a damage omnivamp item, so it replaces Hand of Justice. So you can go for like Infinity Edge, Hand of Justice, that's the Hyperfangs, and the Edge of Night. This is pretty much the most run-of-the-mill build, which is safety. Edge of Night keeps Naafiri safe against burst, crit, and then healing. But you can also do that in the form of artifacts. So if you have something like Pulse Stabilizer allows your ability to crit, which is very similar to Infinity Edge, with the added bonus that you get extra execution range. And so this is like the Infinity Edge. The Hand of Justice is Omnivamp healing and offensive stats, so that's kind of like Hyperfangs. And then you have some sort of evasion or mobility or defensiveness. In this case, Spectral Cutlass teleports to the back line and acts as like a form of offense by assassinating and then kind of evading by teleporting back. And so Spectral Cutlass, so you start to see a little bit of how item sets are working together, but in different ways. And it requires you to build differently depending on what items you have. There's another unique build that we want to highlight, which is Suspicious Trenchcoat. Suspicious Trenchcoat with Naafiri specifically splits into copies of her. All 3 copies will benefit from 5-amp, which sounds busted. And then you cast and you get a bunch of AD through Sterix Gauge, and you need to stay safe with Edge of Night, otherwise they're not going to cast once they split. So this build also is very tight. You need to have all these items, but this Trenchcoat version of Naafiri is also really powerful. It's a lot of yapping, but basically Naafiri is a very in-depth reroll comp that has a lot of item builds. Also, positioning Naafiri is really important. Make sure Naafiri is on the same side as the enemy carry, because when she summons the alphas can kill the tank and then target backline directly, which is really hype. So make sure Naafiri, same side carry. Now, the other element of it is who is your duo carry. You can actually duo carry a lot of different units. If you're rerolling on 6, you can get Nidalee 3. You can try to play some Nitro in the meantime, but in general, it's not a Nitro comp because you just don't really care about the robot, and you don't want to roll for anything besides Naafiri 3 for the most part, at least in the Nitro variation. The actual ideal secondary carry is Yuumi 3, but you're not going to get a lot of times. So if you have Annie 2, just put items on Annie 2. And then any leftover 80 on Samira. If you don't have a good Exotech item, don't worry about Jax and Sejuani. Just play anything. In fact, it's kind of nice that you get 1 free slot. So Jax, Sejuani dropped for, I don't know, Zach, for example, or Garen. Garen's really nice for Strategist mod onto Naafiri. You can do that instead. Item augments end up being really, really solid for this composition. As a result, we probably need to reorder this. Items should probably go in the very front, but not today. Portable Forge, Blatant Forge, just all the forges. People go for that all the time. And then I do think that Naafiri is particularly good if you get Worth the Wait or Caretakers as an excuse to push levels, because ultimately what you care about is that 5-amp. So if Caretakers gives you copies of Naafiri, just push levels, get the Naafiri pretty much naturally without rerolling, and then look for something like Samira and 5-amp. We have Strategist Amp Annie, and just want to add a caveat that this is more like A+, S-. So you're starting to blur the lines a little bit. We have to cut somewhere between the best comps and the second best comps. This comp is really, really powerful when it gets online, and it might perform like an S-tier comp. But part of it is that it's just really, really expensive, and also it's item specific because, as you guys might know, Annie requires a lot of mana generation to get really rolling. And so blue buff, Shojin, and Nashor's is really powerful. But also in this composition, you kind of want to go for something like Yuumi 3. And I just don't know how you're going to get that many tiers without something like Pandora's, maybe get blue battery, 1 buff, 2 buff. Like, it's just kind of hard to get all of that going. And you're also playing a really contested frontline. Like Nico, Echo is pretty much the only AP frontline you really play unless you're playing like Vex Flex. And so it's very tricky to actually get this composition online. As such, it's kind of listed as a fast 9 because the reality is not only do you need these items and you need the econ, but you also need to hit Samira because 5 amp got buffed this patch. So if you're able to get to Samira and get to this board, it's amazing. You're going to struggle a lot in like the mid game until you get to that point because 3 amp is not really that impressive. And if you get 4, you still haven't unlocked the plus 2 amp on your ability scaling. So you really need to get this set core of units online and going. It's actually similar to 7 Street Demon in the sense that if you do take out things like Nidalee and Naafiri and play Viego and other frontline like Garen and whatnot, you actually perform worse. So make sure you play Nidalee and Naafiri and get that 5 amp in. However, I will say that if you're playing like 1-star units in a situation where you have like Naafiri 1, Nidalee 1, Echo 1, Nico 1, Kabuko 1, and you have Annie 2, Yuumi 3, you're still going to lose a lot of fights because your frontline isn't upgraded. So at least try to protect your frontline as best as you can. It's not just purely a glass cannon composition. You need that time in order to spam cast and get all of those abilities rolling. This comp is very, very good on encounters like Scuttle Puddle, Gold Subscription, anything that just gives you a ton of resources. It's set 14 in general, so you will be getting a lot of hacked orbs and carousels and other ways to get there. So yeah, just make sure you play this when you know you can get a ton of resources because if you play on the basic portal, silver start, and no econ until like the end of stage 4, it's going to be really rough. For this patch, the B and C tier is actually pretty close to its extreme ranges. So the top of B tier is actually arguably A-, and then the top of C tier is arguably B-. But we wanted to draw somewhere along the lines of consistency. In general, our tier list is always based on consistency at TFT Academy. And so it's going to be a little bit more conditional to hit some of these comps, even though the top end power of it is pretty solid. We have a Fast 9 variation of Boombot Urgot Vex, and it's pretty solid, especially if you get a Boombot emblem. There are so many variations of this comp. I'm pretty sure I'm going to do my next analysis video on this composition because it is actually really fun to watch and hard to pull off. But if you love Fast 9 comps, but you're stuck in like an AD spot, you can always just play Urgot into Vex and have a lot of powerful top end because you have Garen that can give Boombot mods. Kabuko is a lot more solid. You can splash in a bunch of 5 costs like Viego, for example. And there's so many variations. You don't have to play 6 Boombot if you don't have the Boombot emblem. You can play 4 or 6 Bruiser and slot in more 5 costs. Always put Boombot emblem on your damage dealer because Boombot is basically kind of like Giant Slayer or Guard Breaker. It just amplifies whatever damage you're dealing. So whenever you deal 400 damage, you deal 150 more, which is like 30% damage amp. When you deal 400, you deal 325 more at 4 in Boombot. It's really good. It's basically like doubling your damage. So Boombot does just a ton of damage. So just put it on your damage dealer. Another thing to note is that Static Shiv on Urgot might look a little bit weird, but Boombot damage is mostly magic. It says each dealing, X amount of magic damage. So you need to actually have Shred. And while you do have Fiddlesticks for some built-in Shred, he only hits a few targets. He only casts every so often. You want to activate that much more quickly. If you do end up getting another AZ item, you can move this Shiv off, put it on Kog'Maw, for example, and go for, like a Death Blade or something for Urgot, which I think is totally acceptable. And this composition cap's extremely high. So if you do have a Fast 9 augment, a bunch of econ, get to level 9 with a ton of resources, this is something that you can play. But again, if you don't have Boombot emblem, just play 4 Bruiser for Boombot instead, or play 4 Bruiser plus 5 cost and Urgot Vex. 7 Street Demon Rengar Jinx is actually quite good. The only problem is that you're going to be contested every game, so that's part of the reason why we have it in B tier. Its performance is actually high A tier if you can get there, but right now it feels irresponsible to put this in A tier because it would lead you to believe that you can play it pretty often. And so it's kind of a victim of the meta and the popularity of the tree. If 2 other people just hold Jinx and Rengar, then you already are likely losing multiple placements. Instead of like thinking about a 3rd, you should be thinking about a 5th or a 6th. And so the top end of this is really good. You have to make sure you're not contested. That's the main condition of this composition. But roll on 7, 7 Street Demon on 7, Rengar 3, Jinx 3, hold a bunch of 80 items, leftover items on brand. Thumbs up, you're good to go. Slayer reroll is noticeably worse. Vayne got nerfed. Jarvan is worse, and that affects both its mid game and its late game. And then also compound the fact that Vanguards are more contested this patch because people are playing Vanguard Marksmen. So it's going to be hard to hit Jarvan 3. And so all those factors combined means that Slayers just needs the right lobby for it to pop off. And then you also still kind of need specific items on Vayne. So nothing has functionally changed about the way the comp is played. It's just harder to hit. So kind of similar to the Rengar Jinx comp we just talked about. It's going to be rarer of a spot to pull off, but its top end's still really good. So if you do end up getting Jarvan 3, Vayne 3, Senna 3, you actually still can win lobbies. I've seen it done really well. Veigar Reroll is pretty much gated behind its augments now that enable Cyber Boss. I think New High Score and Cower Weaklings is almost mandatory to pull this off, and that's because the top end is just so less consistent to hits. Nico, Brand, Ziggs, this entire core is just so contested by the Street Demon players. Like, you're not going to hit that, and also Strategist Amp, and then also people who might be rerolling Jinx Rengar. So it's just super hard to hit around Veigar, even if you can get him to 3-star. And so even if you get best in slot Veigar and you get, you know, the Cyber Boss online, you might just still lose anyways because you just can't hit the 2-star variation of your top end board. So pretty much the same as, you know, Vayne and the Street Demon, Rengar, Jinx. I think the tree and the stuff around the main carries is too contested, which is why it's B tier right now. Shaco Reroll has a lot of potential as a reroll composition because Shaco is so good with artifacts. He's pretty much the reroll carry with artifacts currently. And if you have a Shaco 2 and you have an artifact start, you should pretty much think about whether or not you can pull off a Shaco reroll. It's really good at snowballing, and if you find a way to get range extension on Shaco, he's also really powerful. Very, very good with Sniper's Focus, scope weapons. We don't have it here. It does change the way you play Shaco, so maybe we should put up a different composition for Shaco with range, but he's also really good with, you know, scope weapons and double range extension. There's also rapid fire emblem variations of Shaco because rapid fire emblem gives you +2 hex range. There's just a lot to like about Shaco in general. So I would say that he's pretty underrated. I will say that people often misposition him because it's very easy for Shaco to teleport to the wrong side and get himself into trouble. If you do end up playing Shaco here, just be mindful that it's really easy to get punished if you misposition him because he might get himself into trouble. For people who love Zeri and want to play around Zeri, there is one variation that we've discovered that's pretty solid, which is Zeri and Misfortune as a duo carry. And instead of playing for vertical 7 Vexotech, you play 5 Vexotech, and then you have Zeri hold the Rage Blades while Misfortune holds the Sword AD items. It's actually a mirror of Vanguard Marksman if you really think about it. Vanguard Marksman has Aphelios with double Rage Blade and attack speed, and Xayah holds the AD, and you have a 4-cost tank and Leona. And that is very, very similar. So it's basically Vanguard Marksman, but a different variation. But I would say that you aren't really supposed to play it unless you have a good Exotech item for Zeri. And I think the best one is Pulse Stabilizer. So don't try to play this variation without it, in my opinion. And you know that you're going to get resources to have items on Zeri, MF, and Sejuani. Because if you're in a situation where you don't have that many items for Misfortune as your duo, then she's not going to do anything. If you don't have enough resources to actually hit the board and you're stuck on Zeri 1, Misfortune 1, you're not going to do anything. So that's why it's kind of a B tier comp. It can do well if you have the right setup for it. And of course, you know, these are really uncontested 4 costs, so you should be able to hit, especially Zeri, because no one's really playing Zeri. At least the Twisted Fate players are grabbing Misfortune. And then you also have some other really strong augments that can be good for it, like Trait Tracker, Binary Airdrop, Little Buddies. These are all still really good things for this composition. Golden Ox, man, this trait I just think is bait currently, unless you have the Giga opener, like you have Alistar 2, Graves 2, and you have like a Golden Ox emblem. That's probably how you can jam it and get ahead. But if you play this from behind, you are just going to scale the Golden Ox way too slow. They nerfed its base number, and Golden Ox just stacks way slower. So unless you're able to get Golden Ox scaling really, really high by activating the breakpoints repeatedly by the time stage 4 rolls around, you're going to be struggling to actually have a lot of damage amp. And so I've seen people hit Viego 2, Annie 2, Aphelios 2, and they play it from loose streak, and they just still lose anyways because there's just not enough damage amp. That being said, you get Golden Ox into the good spot, it wins out and looks like the most OP trait ever made. It's just crazy. Like, you just print a bunch of items, you get too strong, and you can't ever lose. So there is a tipping point, critical mass, where it becomes really good. It's just really, really hard to get there. So Would not recommend unless you have a very, very high likelihood of win streaking stage 2 and can snowball that into a stage 4 victory, get to level 9, get to Viego. So spot dependent, but amazing when it's really, really good. Couple of new comps that I want to highlight that have potential, and we're not entirely sure where it's placed, so we're putting it high C tier, but it could actually be in that middle B tier, depending on your spot for it. The first is Zeri Reroll with Bruisers. If you love rerolling one cost and you have something like One for All, you know, the reroll augments around one cost, this might be something worth looking at. Zeri 3 got buffed, Mundo 3 got buffed, Alistar 3 got buffed, and if you have a setup where you can play for a 4-star of them, you know, Worth the Wait or Greater Moonlight, it actually get pretty good. I'm also a big fan of Cooking Pot in this composition because Cooking Pot can make both a Techie and a Bruiser emblem, and you can stack something like your Dr. Mundo 3 to be very, very difficult to deal with. It's a composition that's more popular in Asia Pacific and China, not really popular in North America and Europe, but I'm telling you, man, I've seen this do okay, so don't sleep on it. Your duo carry will be Seraphine. She takes leftover items, and there's a possibility that it reverses. Like, let's say you hit Seraphine 3, but you're stuck on Zeri 2, and you can't find any Zyras. Maybe too many Street Demon players are picking up Zyras, so you can't hit Zeri 3. Then just put Seraphine as your primary, but then you're going to have to do Seraphine primary and Brand as your duo, because you're not going to hit Zeri 3. That obviously has a can of worms in itself. How are you going to hit Brand 2 if Zeri is really contested, so on and so forth. Another form of Bruiser Reroll that I think is really good is Morgana Reroll if you have Blighting Jewel and you have specifically this set of items. The situation that you can find yourself in is you are spamming blue buff, you're open to playing blue buff compositions like Vex or Annie, and then you get hit with an augment maybe in stage 2 because there's like multiple ways you can get augments in plural in stage 2. And you open up Portable Forge and you see, oh my gosh, it's a Blighting Jewel. I blue buff Blighting Jewel. I can actually go for Morgana Reroll, and you know I have the Bruiser setup for it. So that's like one situation. Another could be that you open up Blighting Jewel and you're thinking about Fiddlesticks, but then your shop is like Morgana 2, 4 copies of Mundo, and you're like, oh, maybe I end up going for that. I do think it's pretty solid. I also do think that you struggle in the mid game until you get a duo carry. But because you're so far ahead with Morgana dealing a ton of damage and casting repeatedly, you should be able to get to a duo carry. And it could be anybody. It could be Misfortune, Aurora. You could also just play 2 Dynamo plus something else. You could play Viego because you have the Techie with Mordekaiser. You can do a bunch of different stuff. You can also just play like Ziggs because you get Cyber Boss with Kabuko. So you can make that as your duo. Aphelios even because you have Golden Ox with Alistar, and then you have Jin with Marksman, Dynamo. So you actually have a lot of options, which is really, really nice. So don't feel like you have to always play around this. This is just the easiest version to understand. The other thing too that we didn't talk about very much in the other variation is that Mundo is actually really good with some of these artifacts like Talisman of Ascension and Anima Visage. So for that very reason, if you get Living Forge, you get multiple artifacts. I also think that's really good for this comp. Last but not least, I want to give a shout out to one of my favorite compositions in the game, which is Long Crocodile, aka Rapid Fire Renekton. Any kind of range extension on Renekton is really good because it allows Renekton to go crazy with his Frenzy, and he actually ends up popping off a lot. A lot of people actually like playing Rapid Fire Cannon on Renekton, but it's not as good as Rapid Fire Emblem because it gives you the attack speed and the +2 range, which is a big deal. The thing about this composition is that, one, not only do you need to hit Rapid Fire Emblem and the Renekton, which is already very conditional itself, but you also somehow need to have frontline that can sustain it because you're playing so many backline units. It's kind of rare to be in like a situation where you can play, you know, 3 frontline units or even less if you're not hitting things like the Galio and the Sejuani, and not just immediately crumble. So things like Golemify, Dumbify, Cloning Facility, I'm the carry now, anything that just gets stuff in the way and stalls for the Renekton is good. So just take frontline supporting augments. ZZ Rod portals might be valuable as well. Maybe Void Spawn is something we should add here. One trap about Rapid Fire is that it gives you so much attack speed that you actually don't even care about Rageblade anymore. So if you have Zeri with a bunch of attack speed, you can just put AD on her. It's almost like she has Rageblade already fully stacked. So just give her Gunblade, Giant Slayer, you know, Infinity Edge, Deathblade, things like that. But the thing is, 2 and 4 Rapid Fire do want Rageblades. So it ends up being kind of awkward where it's like you kind of want to slam Rageblade early if you're playing around a tempo like Kog'Maw 2. And because if you play like Gunblade, Giant Slayer, Quicksilver, Hodge, Kog'Maw 2, you're not going to actually be that strong. And so you have this like weird mismatch of incongruent strategies of like you want to slam Rageblade early because it's the best way to preserve HP and win streak, and win streaking is what lets you get to Renekton. But it's pretty bad late game, and you don't really want Rageblade on 6 rapid fire itself. So in my opinion, that's why people like to play something like, you know, Cypher early, because 1, these units end up staying in the comp, but 2, you can just kind of use that early game to rack up its resources and just play Lose Streak instead. So you have those options. It's a fun composition. It's a little bit scary. You might melt, but when it gets online, not only is it really hype, it's really powerful. So that's the tier list in a nutshell. A lot of new comps, but in the end, I think it's become less flexible this patch, which is, you know, kind of sad, but at the same time, makes climbing the patch much easier as long as you're picking the right lines and you recognize what to do in the early game based off your openers and your augments. So I love the endgame variety, but I would love a little bit more fluidity in terms of what you can play. Hopefully they tweak that in the next patch, because I do think that this patch has a lot of potential, and I do think it's better than the previous patch. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys next time.